In the previous video, I showed you how I ran conduit through the wall and installed a backbox to receive the network cables that I'm going to be installing in the living room. I've also fed through the cables, and today what I'm going to show you is how I terminated the cables on either side. On the living room side, I decided to use some toolless keystone jacks. There are toolless in the sense that they don't require a punch-down tool. I went for a keystone jack because it allowed me more flexibility in how I would place the socket. I had some special requirements for what I wanted the faceplate to look like, and I wanted it to be flush with the wall, with no bits sticking out, which you tend to have with angled network sockets. The problem I had with that is that it required me to have some deeper backboxes. Last time I talked about how I used Cat7 cable and realized that it was a bit of a mistake. You will find some websites that will tell you, oh, you need to go Cat7 because it's the future. That's not actually true. In theory, proper Cat7 requires a specific type of connection. Cat6a is supposed to do the same job as Cat7 while sticking to RJ45 connector. What the internet really doesn't tell you about is the different types of network cables that you can buy for any category. The cable I got to run through the walls is called SFTP cable, which stands for Shielded Foiled Twisted Pair. What that means is that you've got a braided shielding, and then each pair is wrapped into foil to kind of reduce the interference and the crosstalk. The only reason you might want a shielded cable is if you have to run parallel to some power lines, because the shielding will allow you to reduce the amount of electrical interference that you'll get from nearby live wires. If you don't do shielded cables, you have to make sure that you always cross power lines at a 90-degree angle. For my usage, that was very overkill. When I bought the cable, I thought Cat7 was the way to go. Then I realized that Cat7 cable with a RJ45 connection is really just a Cat6a. And the reason I'm going Cat6a, as I mentioned last time, is because I want to have a 10 gigabit ready. If you know that you're not planning on getting anywhere over 1 gigabit, you can stick to Cat5e. Anyway, moving on to termination. What you're doing when you're terminating is essentially you're cutting through that jacket with a metal blade. That's what creates the electrical connection. On the faceplate end, the termination process is pretty simple. You have to cut the jacket, peel back the shielding, foil, and the ground wire. You want to feed your cable through this little plastic thing, and then you untwist the different wires, lay them out, clip them in place according to whichever termination scheme you want to use. RJ45 has two ways of terminating things, which is just the ordering of the wires. It doesn't really matter which one you use, as long as it's the same at both ends of the cable. What was tricky when untwisting these wires and clipping them into place was to find the correct order in which to feed them through in order to get the flattest result possible, because that will make it easier than to clip it to the rest of the keystone jack. Once you've clipped them into place, you want to trim the excess with a wire cutter, or in that case I just used the scissors from my multi-tool. And then you want to insert the cable with its plastic end into the rest of the keystone jack. You may have to pay attention to the orientation, and then you'll have to close the two metal halves, which will punch down the wires and secure the cable. In my case, the keystone jack required a huge amount of force to close. You should hear a snap when the two halves click in place, and that tells you the thing is securely closed. And then to prevent it from opening again, because it is reversible, you use the provided zip tie to secure the keystone. Before terminating the cables on the other side, I needed to install the network cabinet. I went for a 15U cabinet. I calculated my required size based on the number of devices that I planned on having in, and then pretty much doubled that value to allow for cable management and also give me some room for expansion. I wanted to have a fairly deep network cabinet because I was planning on moving to a rack-mounted NAS, and these tend to be quite deep. So I went for a 800mm deep cabinet. At those dimensions, there was nothing that was wall-mounted. So I went for a freestanding rack. The store that I bought this rack from, you had the choice of having it delivered pre-assembled or having it flat pack. Flat pack meant it was a bit cheaper. In my case, some of the framing got damaged in transport, and it needed a huge amount of effort to bending back into shape without breaking it. So I wouldn't recommend chipping out on this and just get the thing in one bit unless it makes it more complicated for you to move it into its final location. I started putting the rack together using the provided Allen keys. and it took forever. So I decided to stop, went to the shop, and bought myself a set of screwdriver bits, which was one of the best purchases I've done ever since I've started doing any DIY. After the outer frame was assembled, I started placing the internal frame. The instruction manual was a bit vague as to where exactly you should place the different rails because you've got many options. I found myself making the mistake of placing the rack rails a bit too close to the ends, and that would cause the issue later on. After that, I installed the doors and the wheels. The network cabinet came with both feet and wheels. I initially wanted to use the feet, but I found myself moving it very often. It really justified going for wheels instead. Once the network cabinet was assembled, I wheeled it into place, and then realizing I couldn't fit it into its final location under the stairs because the kitchen cupboard was in the way, so I had to move it first. With the cabinet in place, I could then feed the cables into the cabinet and then start the connection to the patch panel. Speaking about patch panel, you've got 3 different types of patch panels. Punch down ones, keystone jack ones, and you've couplers, I think they're called. I went with the punch down one because it was the cheapest, and it turned out to be really the easiest way to do this. What's worth knowing is that there are 2 types of punch down standards, Krone and 110. I've got absolutely no idea what's the difference in terms of performance, if there is such a thing. It's not always obvious which type of punch down your patch panel will require, so I made sure to get a punch down tool that would support both of them. The process for punching down into the patch panel is extremely simple. You just strip the jacket and the shielding like you've done with the keystone jacks. You lay out the wires according to the corresponding wiring scheme you've chosen. Then you just use the punch down tool. This at the same time should trim the wires. Sometimes they will just pop off. Sometimes you'll have to wiggle them a little bit. I guess it depends on the quality of the punch down tool you have. But after that, you're done. Then all I needed to do was to test the cables to make sure that the connections were correct. So I used a cable tester. It tells me if all the connections are the same on either end, and also allowed me to keep track of the different wires. So once the cables are ready, I just need to clean everything up. I went back to the living room, screwed the faceplate into plate, snapped the Euro modules into the keystones, and then snapped those back onto the faceplate. This was kind of hard to do. It became a really tight fit because I had very thick cables, so even though the back box was theoretically deep enough, I didn't necessarily account for those cables getting in the way. I did manage to make it fit in the end. The next time I will need to install a 2-gang back box for network cables, I will use 2 sets of conduits, either going from below or coming from above. And that's it. That's all the cabling I've done for now. After that, I will look into populating the network cabinet and get ready for expansion.